Thank you for sticking around. So the hot mic tape that is probably going to contribute, among other things, to costing Donald Trump the election in November. Seeing just wave upon wave of Republican leaders jump ship from his campaign has inspired a conversation, at least in this show, with friends of ours and with other folks, to talk a little bit about the culture of misogyny and the topic sort of in general. It's a big topic. We're not going to be able to fully discuss it in the last 30 minutes of the show, but Doc kind of demonstrated, if not, and certainly not necessarily misogyny, but demonstrated what can only be called a cultural acceptance of equivocation of misogyny. Now, Doc, when he said that he should hang out with with different kinds of women, it sounded to me, and it sounded to I'm sure a lot of people, as if you were blaming the women for allowing this to happen. Now, and I know that's not what you meant.
No, that is not.
But what I can tell you, and why this is an important conversation to have, is it is easy. It is easy in that moment to make that kind of mistake when you're describing a situation, because the way that we have, and when I say we, I mean just generations upon generations of Americans, whether they be male or female, have been brought up to view these the certain gender roles, certain gender behaviors in a very static kind of way. Donald Trump was bragging about how he would sexually assault women. That's what it comes down to. He was bragging that he could get away with it because he was a star. And there's a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people make, saying, well, how have these women just let this happen? Because women, for the longest time, have been portrayed and thought to be the more passive of the genders, to be the more agreeable, weaker, dumber sometimes, and they're expected to just kind of roll with the punches because it's the men who are strong, it's the men who lead, it's the men who make the decisions. Women have only recently, and this is what's crazy about the change in American culture in the last 40, 50 years, women have only in the last 40 to 50 years of the history of this country started to seize agency for themselves. Women entering the workforce in the 70s and 80s on month. Women now making 53% of the electorate of this country. Women having more of the purchasing power in this country than men for the first time in the last 10 years, I think, is that women now control more of the economic output as far as spending and purchasing power. Women are now a bloc that they never were before in the history of this country, and now are a powerful political bloc. And the culture, especially of the older generation of men and women, both, because you're seeing women, some women defend what he was doing as just, oh, that's how boys are, which is not only insulting to women who have been victims of this kind of thing, but it's also insulting to men who have never done something like that. In a lot of the cases, the generation hasn't caught up. I am sure down to my toes that Donald Trump did not think anything of this comment when he made it in 2005. That didn't even register to him. And 30 years ago, it wouldn't have registered for a lot of people. No. Because that sort of sentiment about what you do with women was more acceptable, or at least ignored. It's never acceptable, obviously, but it was at least ignored in such a way that it is not now, because the culture has changed, and you have a 70-year-old man who, either through his own ignorance or his own stubborn refusal that he's right, hasn't changed. And so it is easy. It is still easy to slip back into that language. Very, very easy, because we have been steeped in it for generations. And it's going to take a lot of work, and conversations like this are a good first step. Well,
and I appreciate you bailing me out there, because the truth is, listeners on the show, this generational gap is something that is true, and it lasts. And when I grew up, you had to ask the girl. In fact, we had a dance called the Sadie Hawkins dance. And that was the only time during the year a girl could ask a guy to a dance. The rest of the time, you had to ask. A woman wouldn't kiss you first, right? Because that would mean she would be what we would call now slut-shamed or sex-shamed or something along those lines. And so you take Trump's generation, and I'm right at the tail end of the bail. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm just on the other side of it. Mm-hmm. And you take these social norms that were ingrained with us, right? You have to open the door, you pull out the seat, all the things, quote, that's chivalry. And part of chivalry, if you look at it, is, you have to go grab that gal. That's how the generation ahead of me was brought up. My generation is really the first generation that went, hold on, women are people too. And that transfer, that cultural move is difficult because your roles have been culturally redefined. Not by much. Not my generation wasn't really as shocking as it is talking to young women today. Katie's one of them. Another just happens. Another person whose intellect I respect is also named Katie. And then, as well as my office manager, Sid, talking to them, their ideas of gender role are so foreign to my generation and the generation ahead of me. We simply don't understand it. I mean, there is not a basis for context.
Well, and
so we're up. Go ahead.
Oh, well, what I was going to say was what is tough about that. What's tough about that in the context of this presidential election is that you have one of the candidates who is fundamentally ill-equipped through either ignorance or his own choice to even recognize that shift has been made, and to concurrently recognize that there's nothing to be done about it at this point. You know, I saw comments from folks about Trump's video saying, of course he respects women. He's appointed women to every level of his businesses. A woman's running his campaign. Other than the fact that it sounds like, hey, I have a black friend, when you use that kind of defense, and it's not very effective, that's missing the point entirely. We're not talking about whether or not he believes women are capable of being employees or running things. We're talking about whether he sees women as people, and he demonstrated through his words that, at least to women he's attracted to, he sees them as things that he can go out and grab. That is not unique to Donald Trump. That is not unique to I guess a criminal that attitude has been ingrained in this culture for a long period of time.
Well, let's take our commercial break. We'll be back right after this. We'll continue to talk about misogyny. We're going to talk about internalized misogyny and how that affects our culture today and creates a lot of gray areas. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We couldn't do what we